Welcome to this edited recording of a webinar held on the 21st of March 2021 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Ted Hughes's masterpiece Crow, from the life and songs of the Crow. I'm Mark Wormald. I'm Fellow in English at Pembroke College, Cambridge, from where I'm speaking to you this evening, and I'm Chair of the Ted Hughes Society. In a few minutes, you'll hear almost 2 hours of fascinating conversation about Crow from a panel of distinguished writers, poets, and scholars. On the evening itself, members of the Ted Hughes Society and Pembroke College joined us from around the world. But we know there were many who were unable to join, and we also think that the conversation deserves to be shared more widely. I'm grateful for the permission of the estate of Ted Hughes and Faber Limited to include extracts of poems from Crow as read by Ted Hughes from his 1997 recording. I'm grateful to the estate of Barry Cook for permission to share with you images of the artist's own responses to Crow, which are now in his literary archive and collection here at Pembroke. And finally, to the composer Benjamin Dwyer for permission to play you his haunting and rightly perplexing piece, Legends, from his 2014 album, Scenes from Crow. You'll hear that very shortly. Finally, I'd like to express my thanks to Daryl Ogden and Tabitha Sparks for their generosity in supporting poetry events at Pembroke College, to Sally March, Development Officer at Pembroke, for all her help in arranging and hosting this seminar, and Mick Gower, Membership Secretary of the Ted Hughes Society, for editing this recording and smoothing over the occasional technological wrinkles and one slightly longer drop in connection suffered by one of our panel on the night. Itself. 50 years ago, this last Monday, Ted Hughes was reading in New York City to coincide with the American publication of Crow, from the life and songs of the Crow. 50 years tomorrow, the New York Times published its second review of a book which the October before had stunned its first British readers. Now, that first Faber blurb sold Crow as an epic folk tale, And we're going to hear this evening how deeply and pervasively Hughes drew on a range of material, notably the trickster literature of indigenous North American peoples and the world's old stories he'd been reading and celebrating for years, alongside all he knew of the Anglophone tradition. But that wasn't in itself enough to justify Al Alvarez's sense of what he called Crow's irrepressible life. This ragged little creature's capacity to survive, bounce back, keep going against all odds amid his and the world's horror. So Alvarez invoked what Hughes had written about his contemporary, the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. This is Hughes. I think it was Miłosz who, when he lay in a doorway and watched the bullets lifting the cobbles out of the street beside him, realized that most poetry is not equipped for life in a world where people actually do die, but some is. With Crow, Alvarez concluded, Hughes himself now joins a select band of survivor poets whose work is adequate to the destructive reality we inhabit. I think he is the only British poet to have done so. The Australian Peter Porter saw that and more. English poetry has found a new hero, and nobody will be able to read or write verse now without the black shape of Crow falling across the page. Others, including Keith Sagar, looked one of the earliest of Hughes's critics and the closest, looked boldly back, urged comparison with the wasteland. Not since T.S. Eliot had there been such fragments shored against the city's environments, which man's rationalism and ideologies and brutalities have brought to nothing, but moving just through the bleakest of laughter and violence towards a water-dripping song, clear water, hope. 50 years on, for all the light those years have shed on this blackbird, does Crow, book and bird, justify that comparison? Does Crow's black shape still fall across our reading, our writing, our lives? Is Crow still as truly compelling for us as the poet and man who created him? Well, that probably depends on when and where and what you read. Here's what Hughes told Egbert Fass about the wasteland in 1970. He was less interested in Fass's sense of the way Eliot weighed his present against the past or constructed a diagnosis of contemporary life and civilization, and much more interested in Eliot's own description of his poem as, quote, a chart of his own condition. Hughes went on, I can't believe that he took the disintegration of Western civilization as a theme, which he then found imagery and a general plan for. His sickness told him the cause. Surely that was it. He cleaned his wounds and found all the shrapnel. Now, of course, Ted Hughes had his own wounds, and his father's from Gallipoli, and a second war, and the nuclear bomb that ended it, and an environment under wholesale attack from man. And of course, yes, he had survived even closer to home. Sylvia's, and then the dedicatees of Crow, Assia and Shura. So is Crow the chart of Ted Hughes's condition? Or have the 2 or 3 generations since proved that his big black bird and his life and songs to be more than that? And what part of Hughes's own sharing of the larger or more extensive and complex dimensions of his Crow's project, his commentaries which made clear the elements of that folk epic, played in all of this? Back to that New York Times article, published 50 years ago tomorrow. Thomas Last wrote that the intensity of learning and feeling Hughes brought in readings to his verse sometimes risked justifying Hughes's wry explanation that Monday of being, as he's acknowledged, more interesting than the poem. But the same, last was sure, was not true of Crow. Even without a single comment, no reader can possibly miss the poet's larger intent. Crow is darkness made visible, and it reflects the darkness that lies at the heart of the world. Perhaps it always was, for Hughes at least. In 1953, 5 years before he let Leonard Baskin in the States, more before he saw those crows, those vast, muscular, powerful crows. But as it happens, 50 yards, as Cambridge corvids fly from where I sit, in Pembroke College, undergraduate Ted Hughes put these words in the mouth of an undergraduate poet critic he just invented for an original composition now in the university's library. This student's name is Gleewit, and he says, in a barbarously new age, verse has to find a speech of childhood, the brutality of the ditch. That alone makes my hair bristle on the nape of my neck. But here is Crow himself, the first we see and hear of him on the first page of Crow, from the second of its opening poems, Two Legends. Already nothing but black, but also already taking flight. Listen to the glee, the determination in Ted Hughes's voice in a recording from 1997 as his baby sets off on his adventures.
Black is the earth globe 1 inch under, an egg of blackness, where sun and moon alternate their weathers, to hatch a crow, a black rainbow, bent in emptiness, over emptiness, but flying.
We are extremely fortunate to have a wonderful panel of speakers, and I'm very grateful to them for joining us this evening. I'm going to introduce you to our 4 panelists first, our main panelists first, who between them will be taking 3 full bites at Crow over the next 90 minutes or so. And then to allow them time to swallow, their thoughts will be interspersed between courses, as it were, by a number of other Grace Note speakers I'll be introducing later, with their own experiences and perspectives on Crow, its challenges, its inspirations, and its gifts. So to introduce our 4 panelists, and I'd like to begin with Dame Marina Warner. Marina has been writing about myths, fairy tales, symbols, and female iconography, and telling stories of her own for almost 50 years. Her many books include Alone of All Her Sex, The Myth and Cult of the Virgin Mary, 1976, the Booker Prize shortlisted The Lost Father, 1988, From the Beast to the Blonde, 1994, wonderful books about the Arabian Nights and fairy tale, and most recently, very recently, in fact, just a few days ago, Inventory of a Life Mislaid, an unreliable memoir. And I should say, heretically, I think probably much more interestingly unreliable than Clive James, an honorary fellow and a former honorary fellow of this college, his memoirs. Marina brings to all she writes a lifetime of thinking about stories and the ways in which they shape our lives. She's the president of the Royal Society of Literature, a distinguished fellow of All Souls, and last but not least, patron of the Ted Hughes Society. You will, I hope, have read her deeply poetic foreword to the 50th anniversary of Crow. Alice Oswald is one of our leading poets. She has published 8 acclaimed and beautiful full-length collections, including Dart, 2002, which won the T.S. Eliot Prize, Woods, etc., 2005, Memorial, 2011, Falling Awake, 2016, which won the Griffin Poetry Prize and the Costa Poetry Award. And I should say, which I've had the pleasure of discussing with one of my final year undergraduates only this week, and Nobody, 2019, the year in which he became the 46th Professor of Poetry at Oxford. She's won the Ted Hughes Award for Poetry and has edited a Ted Hughes Bestiary. And in November, she devoted her third brilliant Oxford lecture, Lines, to the phrasal music of birdsong and of Hughes's crow. Mark Cocker is a multi-award-winning author of creative non-fiction, as well as a naturalist and environmental tutor. He writes and broadcasts on nature and wildlife in a variety of national media, in 2018 completing 30 years as a country diarist for The Guardian and Guardian Weekly. His 12 books covering works of biography, history, literary criticism and memoir include Loneliness and Time, 1992, Birders, 2001, and Birds Britannica, 2005, but its second edition appearing in 2020, Birds and People, 2013, his environmental history, Our Place, and Claxton Diary. But of course, most importantly for this evening, the wonderful Crow Country, published in 2007. In 2016, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of literature from the University of East Anglia, where he's recently placed his archive. And finally, and by no means least, but I think probably the youngest, Grzegorz Kwiatkowski is a poet, musician, a Polish poet and musician, and member of the post-punk band Trooper Trooper. He lives in Gdansk, formerly Danzig, as did earlier generations of his family. Grzegorz has published 7 books of poetry, and his poems have been published in many literary magazines. Modern Poetry in Translation, co-founded, of course, by Ted Hughes, New Poetry in Translation, Rain Taxi, and others. His music's been reviewed and broadcast by some of the world's biggest outlets, including Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, the Chicago Tribune, Newsweek, NPR, the BBC, and others. Trooper Trooper made its first international appearance in 2015 with the album Headache. They've been recording and performing new music ever since. So I'd like to begin with a very simple question for all of you, if it's okay, which is, where and when did you first read Crow? And briefly, how has your sense of it developed? Perhaps
Well, I think I'm the oldest person on this panel. And so I was almost a contemporary. I mean, I'm a bit younger than Ted Hughes, but he was a figure in my earliest years of reading, a mythic figure in both his character, imposing presence, his extraordinary voice, which we heard there, and of course, the tragedy of his life. And then there was his oppositional stance to many things that dominated British culture in those days. He was, and I think in Crow especially, he expressed a kind of anti-poetry to the dominant mode, which Larkin, for example, said that it was time to set aside the myth kitty. And he said this with a sort of sneer. And though he didn't entirely do that himself, but nevertheless, there was this cult of the quotidian. And here came Crow, this extraordinarily powerful mythological figure with a very oppositional content to the dominant mythologies. I think Hughes in Crow is quite close to Blake in terms of his opposition to the prevailing conventions, but the voice, of course, is very, very different. And I was, I was enthralled by the man who was a mythic figure to us, this tragic figure. But I was also felt that he was a partisan of things that I cared about, which was a deep stratum in the life of these islands, but had been somehow obscured by the satirical quotidian, as I said, mode that Kingsley Amis as a poet epitomized and Philip Larkin. And so I gravitated to the Hughesian vision.
Thank you. And so you read it as it came out, essentially?
Yes, he was my suspicion is that I read some of the poems before they were collected. Is that possible?
That is absolutely possible, because he was published.
I was brought up in Cambridge. So I think that there was, people, I knew quite a lot. I didn't know him. My father had a bookshop in Cambridge. He knew quite a lot of these people. I'm sure Ted Hughes was in the shop.
When I first came across Crow, it was in the selected poems that I bought for myself very early on when I just left university and was kind of ranging around trying to find a verse form that was sort of adequate to what I was doing, which was gardening. And in this selected poems, the Crow poems look as if they're kind of part of all the other poems, which actually they really aren't. It's a very different kind of book, Crow, from his other books. So I think at first I was sort of really puzzled by the way this selected poem suddenly went into this different register. And I fastened on a couple of them that seemed to show me a way forward in which I suppose syntax took the place of meter. And that kind of really excited me because it made me feel that there could be rules that were different from the conventional rules that I kind of knew about. But at that stage, I couldn't match something like Crow and the Birds with something like A Childish Prank. I sort of felt these are so different, but they're obviously both following some invisible rule. And I sort of thought, I'm going to put this aside and I really want to know what's happening, but I need to get to know the rest of Hughes first. So I sort of soaked myself in his work, and I think it was really only by reading around what he was trying to do in Crow and getting myself a copy of Crow's poems rather than Crow inside select poems that I began to feel, yes, this was, almost more interesting than his other work, because it kind of opened a new shaft outside the sort of the lyric personal voice into something that was more multiple, more ancient, and even went beyond what I was beginning to find the sort of mannerisms of conventional English poetry. So it just opened this new, direct, raw voice that became a new direction to follow, I think.
It was, I guess, 10 years ago, and it was rather strange way because I came to this great book by Edgar Lee Masters and his Spoon River anthology, and because the Polish translator was Michał Sprusiński, and he also wrote afterward to collections of Ted Hughes poetry. It was printed in 1975 in Poland. Right. And so I was so obsessed with Edgar Lee Masters and great translations of Michał Sprusiński that I came into the world of Ted Hughes, and it was like electric shock, really. And it didn't matter if it's a poetry or it's not a poetry, if it's a song or it's not a song. It was just a big thing. And then I thought about him as a brother of William Blake, as a brother of Czesław Miłosz poetry. So I thought about him as a poet of trauma and a poet of shamanic experience. And I'm reading this book a few times per year for many years. And so, yeah, for me, it's just super essential thing in my spiritual life. And I even really don't analyze it. You know what I mean? That for me, it's one whole big mysterious thing that helps me in paradoxical way. It helps me in being a better person because of this kind of poetry. I found a lot of evil inside of myself, and then I try to be a better person.
I'm going to take us on because one of the many things that Mark writes beautifully about in Crow Country, and I know he feels strongly about the representation of corvids in Ted Hughes's book, is the music, the lyricism, the cry of the corvids. And I've just been struck by the sense in what Alice and Marina in particular have written recently about the music of Crow. Marina, you've mentioned that, written that Crow's rough music, harsh and comic by turns, rises from the poet's deepest being in response to hidden primordial forces. Alice, in your Ted Hughes Bestiary introduction, you've said there that the language comes out in crow and cave birds, tensed and singing as if by dictation from the underworld. I wonder whether I could just set against those very powerful senses of what you've already begun to mention, of the uniqueness of Hughes's way of presenting an alternative to lyric. Something that Hughes said in his reading at the Hay Festival in 1996, when he described my protagonist, who's just a lump of protoplasm really, fairly unformed, with no music, very little voice, and only the rudiments of experience. So I wonder whether anyone who is now on the call, and I do hope Mark is back, would like to say more about the music of Crow, given that I should say we have at least 2 composers in our audience who've been inspired by Crow, and you've already heard Benjamin Dwyer's response to Crow. So Alice, maybe, Marina, would you like just to say a little bit more about your sense of the music of Crow?
I've spoken a lot about the music in my lecture about Hughes, so I won't kind of go back over that. But I suppose my sense of what you just said, Mark, about the kind of the lumpen unmusic of the verse, it is particularly the structure of these poems is often that he'll create an incredible music through the poem, which he then deflates at the end. And you get a lot of last lines of these poems that are on a sort of rumbling bass note. And I love that. There's a sort of humor in it that stops one, getting too tragic, taking it too seriously. So you go through the music and then you get this kind of practical joke almost at the end. Is that your sense, Marina?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of consonants. I mean, one of the lines that comes at the end of a poem is the spat out scrag. Spat out scrag. Scrag is almost not a word, is it? I don't know, but it's the sound, these harsh, grating sounds. But I think they have a conjuring property. I think that quite a lot of the music can be related to charms, to curses, to blasphemy, to various forms of what is technically called performative speech, where you actually address the world directly in order somehow to withstand it or change it. And these sharp staccato lines, as you've written about, but also these sounds, these grating sounds, they're not just onomatopoeic of the crow. They are ways of rousing energy in order to draw it into oneself and be able to use it to protect oneself as well from all the harshness and the ghastliness that the poems also very much conjure.
So there is, for all of its super simple, super ugliness, which Ted talked about, there is actually line by line extraordinary range, variety, subtlety within that. I think that's what you're, yeah. Thank you. And I think, and Alice, I completely convinced by your argument that it is a use of the line. And I think the way that you say at the beginning of your Oxford lecture that, and I think Marina might come back to this a little later, that it's a line which speaks against and leans into the silence of the surrounding page. I think it's a very, very powerful, and it's still extraordinarily a radical sense of music in there. Grzegorz, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to say something about not only this poetry, but about reading of Ted Hughes. And I think when I was preparing to this seminar, I was suddenly I thought about there is a no wave kind of a rock band called Swans. It's an American band. Michael Gira is a leader. It's one of the most famous and the biggest band right now. Anyway, it's really radical. And Michael Gira speaking or his manner of singing is super similar to Ted Hughes, and it's very in some way brutal, but it's not melodramatic. And sometimes it's almost really funny, like short novels of Franz Kafka. And when Franz Kafka was reading his novels people were laughing from some fragments. And now we are reading Kafka in a very serious way, but Kafka was fan of Charlie Chaplin. So, I think that there are a lot of ingredients in Hughes' poetry, especially in Crow. And it's, of course, one thing, but it's not melodramatic. And usually this kind of very hard war zone stuff is very, very usual, very melodramatic. And he don't even touch this territory. It's great.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce the first of our Grace Note speakers, my good friend and colleague, Terry Gifford. Terry has been publishing on Ted Hughes since 1978, sometimes as then in collaboration with Neil Roberts, sometimes books of his own, sometimes massively significant edited collections of Hughes. Terry's published 7 books in total on Ted Hughes. He's also a fine poet. Terry, I think you're going to be talking to us about reading Crow from the Anthropocene. So over to you.
So I'm feeling a bit like Gleewit, sadly, because we are, of course, now reading Crow in the Anthropocene, the geological era in which human alteration of the world will be recorded in the Earth's strata. To read Crow from the Anthropocene, from our position of guilt and of our need for renewal, is to feel a tension between hubris and humility. I say feel because the hairs stand up on my neck as I read that Crow's utmost gaping of brain in his tiny skull was just enough to wonder about the sea. What could be hurting so much? Amongst all the forms of human hubris observed and exposed by Crow are small moments, aren't there, of humility, of listening with wonder that also speak to our moment now, 50 years on. As the oceans warm and rise around us, its creatures are already moving towards the poles at the rate, we're told, of 17 kilometers a decade. Oceans and rivers, the 2 homes of Hughes's iconic salmon, are hurting. The Atlantic salmon and the human species are both in trouble. Water is at the bottom of all things, we're reminded at the end of Crow. The water of tears, that is also the water of life. Crow was being finalized just as Hughes was launching the pioneering magazine Your Environment, with its colored central pages of live environmental issues culled from the news. It was in number 3 that Hughes wrote his review of Max Nicholson's The Environmental Revolution, in which Hughes made his famous eco-feminist analysis of Reform Christianity's rejection of Marian religion. It was published before the term ecofeminism was coined in France in 1978. The 3 female deaths in 1969 that brought the Crow Project to an end, of lover, daughter, mother, were a personal tragedy that did not eclipse the goddess. She's there in what Marina Warner identifies as the 3 Eskimo songs that conclude Crow. Despite its premature curtailment, Crow is a complete work of art. After the water of tears is the pulse of life in Little Blood, sucking death's mouldy tits, but singing in our ears, if only we can hear. It is the pulse that connects us to the world. In the British Library is a scrap of paper. Yvonne Roddick has published it in her book, on which is written, it's probably the earliest plan for the Crow Project. It's clear that Crow's trial in the other world and his reparations, marriage labours are in Crow Part 2, which is called Cave Birds. But the Eskimo songs that conclude Crow do sing of world repair, the last two words of that early plan, world repair, if we listen carefully now from the Anthropocene. These are, after all, from the life and songs of the Crow.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you. Really fascinating. And I think something of what Terry has just said will also be picked up in that by our next speaker, though from a very different perspective. It's my great pleasure to welcome Malcolm Guite to this webinar, though I do so in a typically 2021 way, and I hope this works too. Malcolm is remarkably in real demand tonight. He's currently addressing a seminar on Coleridge, and he's going to join us at about 7:30. But in the meantime, he pre-recorded this contribution, which I hope will play shortly after I've introduced him. Malcolm Guite is a poet, priest, and life fellow of Girton College, Cambridge, as well as a member of Pembroke, as will become clear in what he says. He lectures widely in England and North America on theology and literature. His books include Faith, Hope and Poetry, 2010, The Singing Bowl, Collected Poems, 2013, Parable and Paradox, 2016, Marina, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and David's Crown. And Malcolm is going to talk to us about Crow and theology, and one of the challenges it sets a man of faith.
It's a joy to be here. Ted Hughes, the poetry of Ted Hughes fell, or rather struck into my life like lightning, or perhaps even also kind of darkening as well as a lightning, when I was a teenager in the mid-70s, and I just randomly pulled a book of his poetry off the shelves. And it was, well, we've already heard someone talk about the hair on the back of the neck standing on end. My response to the poetry was visceral, because the poetry itself was so visceral. And of course, Crow, as you can imagine, had a huge impact. At that time, I wasn't, as I thought, in any way concerned with theology, and would have been voted boy least likely to become a priest. But when I, probably my time at Pembroke would testify to that too, but when in fact I came to feel that this great central mythos of a meeting of heaven and earth on a tree of agony, and a God who dies and whose blood is shed, actually began to make sense to me. One of the things that came back to me, curiously enough, even though I know it wouldn't have been Hughes's own purpose, but the writing has a life of its own, was that, well, Heaney once said that poetry gives phrases that feed the soul. And I found phrases from Crow coming back to me, and both questioning and, because questioning, deepening my theology. I should say that at the time I was studying theology in the 80s and 90s, it was in a very dry and desiccant period. In the 50s, Rudolf Bultmann and others had set about a program of demythologizing the gospel, rather in the way a certain kind of reductive science was demythologizing nature. And I felt, I suppose, being partly nurtured by Hughes, that what we needed was not demythologization, but remythologization. And we needed a kind of personal and imaginative remaking of all things, not a desiccant dissection of all things. So I found as a Christian priest rereading Crow, that there were phrases that centered in. Now, you might think the obvious starting place here would be, of course, the poem called Crow's Theology. And, you know, everybody likes to say, oh, Crow realized God loved him. But there's a much deeper theology in the idea, having said that God spoke Crow, that God also speaks stone. And then the great question of theodicy, what does it mean to say that he also loves the shot pellets? Where is the pain in all of this? But the line from that poem that has resonated with me ever since is, just existing was his revelation. And I continue to feel that that's somewhere at the core of my theological being, that one is shocked by the revelation of existence itself. But I think the greatest theological poem in Crow is Crow Blacker Than Ever. And I just a phrase or two, if I can, from that, because it seems to me they give us images with which to think, even though we might be thinking in a different realm. I mean, Crow is a kind of a riff on or an anti-version of Genesis in many ways, and I wouldn't want in any way to diminish Hughes's rebarbative and interrogative attack on the faith that I hold, but nevertheless I learn from him. So I love this start with disgust between God and man, and then that little reference back to Yeats, things looked like falling apart. But it's this, but Crow nailed them together, God and man, nailing heaven and earth together. So man cried, but with God's voice, and God bled, but with man's blood. Now, this may not have been Hughes' intention, but I can tell you, I have searched the phrases, the millions of pages of dusty theology, and I've never found a better account of what I think about atonement, what I think about the visceral and bloody realities of crucifixion, but crucifixion understood as something we do to God, although we sometimes feel that God does it to us. It's all there. And then the going on, heaven and earth creaked at the joint, and the creaking joint becomes a horror, but the agony doesn't diminish. Man could not be man, nor God God. That sense of the impasse, but the importance of the point of juncture and the use of the word nailed. And then the final turn of that poem, quite astonishing. This is my creation, says Crow. Now, I think the deepest theology finds the sources of creation precisely in the agony and the atonement. And it's all there in Crow, blacker than ever. And I don't suppose many theologians will read it, but I wish they would.
Malcolm, thank you very much indeed for that. Extraordinarily powerful insight. In response to a view of Hughes as profoundly but challengingly, and Crow engaged with radical reimagining of a creator and the creation. And Malcolm talked about Hughes's rebarbativeness of his attack on Christianity. I think all I would comment, but I'd really be delighted to hear from any of the panelists in response to anything that Terry or Malcolm have said. All I would say is that is David Troopes, I think, has argued very persuasively, and I think Hughes wrote very persuasively about his critique of Western Christian tradition and the God that emerges from that, rather than a creator. And in the sleeve notes to the Clador recording, a copy of which we've got in the Barry Cook archive here, he refers to the being men call God. This particular God, of course, is the man-created, broken down, corrupt despot of a ramshackle religion who bears about the same relationship to the creator as, say, ordinary English does to reality. I wonder whether any comments about in response to anything that Terry or Malcolm has said. Marina.
Well, I think that this idea that ordinary English bears to reality is very key, because I think one of the strands in Hughes's angry, gleeful assault on what we hold and don't think about his iconoclasm is actually on language itself. I mean, as you know, later in his life, he complained bitterly that writing had actually cost him the tapping down into that inner world that he wanted to get, which he does reach with Crow. But the writing endless essays, which he did brilliantly, but had kind of destroyed his spirit. And there's also a strand early on, I mean, in the Crow period, in which he really feels that language lets us down because it creates a false semblance of experience. It kind of cloaks experience. And in some senses, it's also the non-true God. And by pushing language in the ways that we were talking about before, pushing it to its extremes, to drawing out from it, pressing out from it this harsh music, he was actually able to raise the anti-God that was the truer force than perhaps the truer force of nature, possibly a goddess even, that would counteract these. I mean, I don't see him I'm afraid, as a Christian religious poet at all. I think he draws on sacrificial language, but there's a real rebellion, a hot, powerful and all-consuming rebellion, which we're caught up in when we read him.
Thank you. I think I would now like to let us hear a little bit more of Ted's reading from the 1997. Another kind of recording, another kind of challenge to readers who live in a world that has been traumatized. And I was reflecting when Malcolm was talking about the crucifixion and what Crow Blacker Than Ever does in representing that, to a phrase of Hughes's in his essay Myth and Education, where he talks about the power of myths and the detail and the depth held in particular phrases, particularly when in collision. And one of the words in that phrase that he came up with was crucifixion, and the other was Hitler's crucifixion. And this essay generates enormous energy from this, and it takes us back to the particular disaster that Hughes and Crow were living through. And I'm just going to play you the opening of A Disaster, and then I'm going to ask Grzegorz to pick up from there, if that's okay.
A disaster. There came news of a word. Crow saw it killing men. He ate well. He saw it bulldozing whole cities to rubble. Again he ate well. He saw its excreta poisoning seas. He became watchful. He saw its breath burning whole lands to dusty char. He flew clear and peered. The word oozed its way, all mouth, earless, eyeless. He saw it sucking the cities like the nipples of a sow, drinking out all the people, till there were none left, all digested inside the word.
Yes, so for me, this is a key poem of the whole cycle and book. And so can I now say about my experience with this book, and according to Polish literature and my,
absolutely,
yeah. So you know, on the territory of Poland, one of the biggest genocide in the history of the world took place. The action Reinhardt, and most of Polish people live in a state of trauma, even if they don't recognize it, or even if they are not conscious about it. And I think that this firstly that this poetry and this poem is very, for me, revealing. But you know, I will just very shortly, I will say about our normal situation. I think that most of Polish people has got the same roots. For example, my grandfather was a prisoner of concentration camp Stutthof. His sister was a prisoner of concentration camp Stutthof. After war, she was mentally ill. He was really broken. Then my father was rather a shy, calm person. And I'm, let's say, the first generation who is trying to deal with this traumatic war experience. Of course, I didn't see war. So, you know, for me, it's kind of, I'm the third generation who is trying to deal with this tragic past. And I think the book of Ted Hughes is helping me with this experience, and it's super powerful. But for me, it's a feeling of relief.
I don't see it at all as a Christian text, and I see the great power of the set of poetry is that it refracts in different ways for different people. But I mean, that poem, A Disaster, seems to me watching the news about Vietnam, about the lies that were being trawled across America that were justifying the slaughter of 3 million Vietnamese. I mean, as this poem was being written, we were seeing that on our screen. And I think what the sort of defiance of language, or the way in which language stands in opposition to life, is a very much a very scientific interpretation of how life exists. I mean, life is oblivious to us and to humanity, and life, as it is exemplified by Crow, is a kind of amoral but resourceful and extraordinary volcanic force, and that's how I see it as an atheist myself, and as a believer in the Genesis as described by science. I see Crow as a powerful expression of that. So it's interesting how we can take the poem in so many different ways.
That's a sign of its richness, isn't it? And from wherever we're reading this from around the world. So far within Europe, but we are about to go to the States. I'm now going to invite my PhD student, Katherine Robinson, to join us. Katherine is a PhD candidate at Pembroke College, Cambridge, where she's researching Ted Hughes' engagement with early Welsh literature. Her poetry, fiction, and essays have appeared in leading literary magazines on both sides of the Atlantic, and she now joins us from mid-afternoon at home in Washington, D.C. So Kate, over to you. You're going to be talking about Crow Goes Hunting.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I first became interested in Crow when I read Crow Goes Hunting, because when I read it, it seemed to replicate very precisely and very powerfully a medieval Welsh story about the birth of a bard called Taliesin. And that story had always meant a lot to me in my own life. And so I became really curious when I recognized it there in that poem. And it's a story about Taliesin, but it's also a story about another character named Morfran. And Morfran quite literally means cormorant, but mor is sea and vran is a lenition of bran, which means crow. So many 20th century writers have translated it as sea crow or sea raven. And so I really wanted to know if Hughes knew this story and what it meant to him. And it turned out that he did. His library at Emory includes this book, which is a 1902 edition of the Mabinogion, translated by Charlotte Guest. So Guest's Mabinogion is a collection of medieval Welsh tales that she gathered and translated in the 19th century. And Hughes also would have encountered this story when he read The White Goddess by Robert Graves, which he read during his very first term at Pembroke. And I was able to see that edition of The White Goddess when I went to Emory, and it turned out that he had marked that story of Taliesin. He had drawn a line down the margin next to that story. And finally, but importantly, one of his closest friends when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge was a man named Daniel Hughes, who is now the leading expert on Welsh manuscripts, including that story of Taliesin. And he told me that these Welsh stories were common ground for them when they were undergraduates. So I'm going to briefly tell that story, that Welsh story, and then look at the poem. So in the story of Taliesin, a sorceress named Credwen gives birth to a son named Morfran, who is, quote, the most ill-favored man in the world, end quote. Hughes famously told Keith Sagar that in writing Crow, he had forged a, quote, super simple, super ugly language. So what better embodiment of that super simple, super ugly language than Morfran? Hoping to make her son so wise that ugliness won't matter, Credwen gathers herbs and she boils them for a year and a day, after which time they will distill down into 3 drops of awen, which means inspiration. She hires a boy, Gwian Bach, to tend the cauldron. And when a year and a day have nearly elapsed, she and her son come back and sit by the fire, but they fall asleep. That awen finishes boiling and those 3 drops leap out of the cauldron and they scald the thumb of Gwian. So he sucks his thumb to ease that burn and he ingests the awen that was meant for Morfran. So Credwen awakes, she's furious, she tries to kill him, but he turns into a hare and he races away. and she becomes a greyhound and pursues him. He becomes a fish, leaps into the river. She becomes an otter and swims after him. He becomes a bird and rises up into the air. She becomes a hawk and pursues him. He becomes a grain of wheat, and he drops down out of the sky into a heap of winnowed grain. But Credwyn becomes a hen, and she finds that exact grain that is Gwion and eats it. She thinks she's killed him, but 9 months later, she gives birth to Taliesin, who becomes a great bard. So Crow Goes Hunting begins with the line, Crow decided to try words. And Hughes describes these words. They are a pack of words that are described in the language you'd use to describe greyhounds, to describe dogs. And Crow points out a hare, and those words chase after it. And then that poem continues to replicate the Welsh story because that hare, that fleeing hare, changes. It changes into a concrete bunker. And then the words become bombs, and they bomb the bunker, and the bunker becomes pieces of rubble, and they fly up into the sky and become a flock of starlings, just as Taliesin changes from that fish into a bird. And then the words become shotguns, and they shoot down those starlings, and then those starlings become a cloudburst. And to me, that image of a drop of rain, the shape of it echoes a grain of wheat falling down out of the sky. And the words become a reservoir, and they collect that cloudburst. And that, to me, really evokes Credwyn's womb, when she becomes that hen and she swallows the grain, and the grain is contained in that sort of internal reservoir of her womb. And then there's a moment of unity there, because both words and hair, for a moment, are both water. They're both the same thing, one entity. But then finally, that cloudburst, which was originally the fleeing hare, it rises up and it becomes an earthquake, and it swallows the reservoir.
The earthquake turned into a hare and leapt for the hill, having eaten Crow's words. Crow gazed after the bounding hare, speechless with admiration.
It's an extraordinary ending. And the hare eats Crow's words, just as Gwion eats Morfryn's awen. And Crow is speechless. But Crow instigated the use of words, just as Morfryn's ugly presence instigated the creation of that awen. This super simple, super ugly language of Crow is instigated by experiences that can't be spoken, I believe, that exist outside of language. The collection, as we've mentioned, confronts grief, responding to Plath's death, and also to memories of World War I Hughes inherited from his father, and it acknowledges that power of inherited memory. Mark said that it responds to a world that has been traumatized, and I think that's true. And in this poem, words do not catch what they're after. Instead, they are consumed by it, and it leaps for the hills. Reviewing a collection of ballads in 1965, Hughes wrote that ballads tell stories in, quote, words that cannot be outflanked by experience, end quote, that express, quote, the general dumb chorus of human evidence. That is the language he is striving for in Crow, a linguistic equivalent to speechlessness, expressing and embodying that, quote, dumb chorus of human evidence, end quote, that wonderful paradoxical phrase. It's the counterpart to bardic eloquence, just as Morfryn is the counterpart to Taliesin. And Mark said that Crow is darkness made visible. I think it's also speechlessness made audible.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. Among the many surprises I had when taking delivery of the Irish painter and fisherman Barry Cook's literary archive and collection in the spring, the sketch he made in detailed response to Crow Goes Hunting was one of the most moving, not just for the way it shows him following in the transformations described in the poem and by Kate just now, and catching the life of that hare, but for the detail, subtlety, delicacy with which this artist read and responded via annotation and imagery to his close friends' poems. He'd been doing this for at least 10 years, probably longer, as Cook's wonderful letters to the man who introduced them in 1958, the Irish-American scholar Jack Sweeney, reveal, and as the earliest letter from Hughes to Crow in the archive now at Pembroke confirms. And Barry was doing this now for Crow, because he'd been commissioned to produce an image for the cover of a recording by Cladder Records that was released in 1973. It was his second Cladder album cover, having produced one for the 1968 recording of Barry's friend John Montague and Seamus Heaney's The Northern Muse. It may have been through that work that Barry and Seamus first met. But this was a rather different challenge. Barry knew, of course, that Crow had begun with Leonard Baskin's crows. And in a letter to Ted among the Hughes papers at Emory, Barry writes, when it's all done, I hope you can like my drawing for your crow record, this one. Quite different from Baskin's crow, brackets, which I like more and more. That's a telling admission, made only when he'd proved the distance. The image finally selected from the cover is nothing like the massive muscular genital hulk of Baskin's beast. On the contrary, it's skeletal, threadbare, vulnerable, something like a Corvid equivalent of Pickwick's Mr. Jingle. Now, Hughes's sleeve notes are by contrast full of taut economy, as well as the earliest sketch in writing, I think, in published writing of that frame narrative of his folk tale. Now, other earlier letters at Emory and later letters to Seamus in the archive suggest the journey and the experiments which Barry made in getting to his final crow. Several are in black bicycle enamel. One of those showing that Crow was, as of course he is in Crow's Fall, white. Before he returned from his encounter with the sun, charred black. There he is, white. He also produced studies of heads. Barry responded to Crow the stabbing swallower, the black rainbow, and of course to Crow's eye. Another, close to the image finally chosen, wing joints clearly visible, bone joints visible, and one charcoal image, which you've seen before, in sheer wild beauty beats them all, I think, for me. And all these I was expecting from the catalogue of the archive I saw. But I wasn't prepared for the small B5 notes, like that one of Crow Goes Hunting, complete with page number, or these other early delicate thoughts, many of them from early in Crow's life. Before we knew he's indestructible, but when he was already clearly enough the trickster or prankster, still forming though, still finding his way through this wrecked world and doing his own bit of damage to it too. So here are two writhing halves from page 15 from that first 1971 edition of Crow, a childish prank, with an idea of his own from the page and poem before, The Door. Barry writes, forget this horizon. Here, all on one small page, are ideas, readings of lineage on page 10, Crow and Mama and Crow communes. In that last, about to fly, there, about to fly. Again, Barry's though, the mountain of God's shoulder on which in that poem Crow squats, from which he takes chunks chewingly, clearly is not going to be enough for him. Here is baby Crow, head down, looking for something to eat. And here, and it's all very faint, but you must come and visit the archive when it's open. Here, and I've just lost control of my cursor, are the faintest thoughts about Crow and the black beast. Here's Crow on the beach, page 34. Crow ego, page 50. Very precisely an image for the first stanza of Crow Tyrannosaurus. There we go. These are just sketches, but of Crow under that hatched cloud of what a reading of the poem makes clear is a cloud of mourning and lament. hearing it and looking round fearfully. Crow's nerve fails here. And then finally, there we go, his nerve failing. Look at that open beak. And then finally, small crows emerge. There we go, in brown first, and then in black. And then, not so inexplicably as you might first think, bone joints. Barry was producing vivid bone boxes, three-dimensional artworks at the time, which inspired Seamus too. All these are insights into the humanity of Crow, as well as into his energy, his indestructibility, but attempts to finding ways of not being either boring or basking. In the end, though, Barry realized he couldn't avoid Crow, but he also knew something else, so that while he went on to confess, I find it ridiculous that Crow has little to do with crows, that although Crow has little to do with crows, all I could find myself drawing was a crow. That couldn't be helped, I'm afraid. And then he added, it is a simply magnificent book. After reading upon reading, a conservationist's handbook, text for survival, lightning. Now, Mark, is it a conservationist handbook?
Yes, I think it is. I think, you know, if we see Crow as a metaphor for the undifferentiated genetic inheritance of 10 million species, the inexorable power of life, indifferent to humanity and the moral schema which we devise, and to language and consciousness. I think we see Crow as a survivor of the devastation which humans visit on themselves and upon the planet. So, I mean, we're living amidst the sixth extinction, and most of it is driven by human action. We've lost 50% of all biodiversity in the last 50 years. I think the number of bird species, John Fanshaw's in the audience, so he'll put me right, but it's about 1,200 species of all the 10,000 species of bird are now threatened with extinction. We are crushing life slowly and inexorably, but it is unassailable. You know, the vanity, the very idea that we will destroy life is a joke. We'll destroy our own existence because we'll so reduce the planet. And I think Hughes, you know, the crow's survivability, the fact that it's always pops up at the end, this little bird, surviving everything that's thrown at it, means that Hughes sees life as a kind of unassailable process, which of course it is, largely in monocellular form. It will be bacterial forms that survive and lower forms of life, but they are completely inexorable and there's nothing we can do to end them. And however much we devastate the planet, it will survive. So there is a kind of conservation message, bleak and dark and black though it might be. There's a second point which is quite interesting, which is that this is the 29th most denatured country on earth. The English landscape has been devastated by agricultural action in the 20th century. One of the ironies is that crows have massively increased in this radically simplified landscape. So corvids are as invulnerable as Crow seems in the poem. I mean, truthfully, you know, no matter what we throw at our landscape, no matter how reduced it is, corvids are very successful. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a potent image. We both love them and hate them simultaneously because they seem indifferent to what we throw at them. The other interesting thing is the increasing evidence, partly being discovered in Cambridge labs, that corvids are as intelligent as many of the primates. We've granted our close relatives a status of intelligence, chimpanzees, etc. Crow intelligence is one of the highest of all avian forms and of all the life forms which we share the planet with. And yet there is only a single country on earth that grants protection to corvids, and that's Australia. The rest of Europe, all the countries of Europe, have no legislation to protect crows. So so crow's kind of survivability is a perfect metaphor for, it's a very dark message, if you like, but it is a kind of conservation message. Or let's put it this way, it's such an extraordinary set of poems. It's loaded with these ideas, and they're there in the text. And that's what I think is so wonderful about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. So a sense of in which the natural world, despite what we have continued to throw out in the 50 years since Crow, despite that loss of diversity still proves what Hughes was saying.
Yes, I think you know, I wouldn't take much comfort from what Hughes is saying, but I think there, buried in it, is the kind of yes, it's something very hopeful that out of devastation, life will continue in extraordinary diversity. If you put your spoon in the soil and brought up a single spoon of soil, it would contain probably 7,000 species of bacteria. We are surrounded by the kind of biodiversity that is invulnerable to our actions, and Crow kind of speaks of that. I mean, as I say, that's the extraordinary potency of Hughes's symbol. I mean, I quite like to say a little bit at some point, let me shut up now, but I'd quite like to say something about where Hughes got the mythological associations with crows, and how also he's borrowed from real natural history to construct a mythic corvid, because this is not a real bird. But I'll shut up now and let somebody else speak.
I'm really interested, though, that in parallel and knitted closely into that story that Crow tells is also Hughes's continuing efforts, despite what he says in that sleeve note, Circumstances, to tell that epic folk tale, and one in which, as you said, the primates and the relationship between a man and a woman are absolutely central. And I think, Alice, you were interested in saying something a little bit more about that, and a movement towards hope, which within Crow in its first version, Hughes does not get very far, but I don't want to say what you want to say, much better.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I want to acknowledge, I may not pronounce his name right, but Grzegorz was saying kind of, you know, really extraordinary things. It is amazing that this poem, kind of written in England, can respond to things that have happened in, you know, things that we can't even imagine perhaps here. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, but also to say that one of the things I love about Crow is its incompleteness and the sense that we're taken through this blackness, this darkness, but we're meant to move through a kind of purgatory and into something better. And I think it really plagued Hughes for the rest of his life that he didn't sort of get to that ending. But for us, I think it's rather beautiful, that it isn't vocalized, so we can imagine it as we want. But those last poems in the Crow collection, some of which in that recording you speak about, I mean, I think it comes from Cave Birds, the bride and groom lie hidden for however many days.
3 days.
It sort of suggests to me that almost all his poems, perhaps starting with Hawk Roosting in Lupercal and going right through to Birthday Letters, they're all actually trying to work out this question of, once you move beyond the subjective individual, you've got to sort of cope with what it's like to be something else. And I think that question about how the male and the female relate, which is after all what Homer's poetry, Dante's poetry, what all those great epics are kind of on about. I think the way Hughes was trying to move into that, but couldn't at that stage, it means that he sort of had that momentum that the rest of his poems carry on being about that, and his essays. So that's always given me a kind of, perhaps a place to pursue it in my own imagination, the fact that he didn't complete it in Crow.
But I'm really struck by, not just in this reading, and we're going to hear the end of Bride and Groom Lie Hidden for 3 days, which, as you say, was from Cave Birds, but also in that extraordinary 1996 Hay Festival reading. Hughes is moving as he's developing and sharing the sense of Crow carrying the hag, the composite female, through this river, weighed down. He precedes that with poems about his mother, poems about Sylvia from birthday letters, though of course we don't yet know it's from birthday letters, poems about Assia, and identifying Assia very closely by date of birth, but then talks about this little bit of protoplasm carrying a composite female. And so it's really fascinating that he is continuing and sharing as openly as he does, and getting closer, I think, to what you've just talked about. Anyway, can we just listen to the end of Bride and Groom? Thank you very much, Alice.
She gives him his teeth, tying their roots to the centre pin of his body. He sets the little circlets on her fingertips. She stitches his body here and there with steely purple silk. He oils the delicate cogs of her mouth. She inlays with deep-cut scrolls the nape of his neck. He sinks into place the inside of her thighs. So, gasping with joy, with cries of wonderment, like two gods of mud sprawling in the dirt, but with infinite care, they bring each other to perfection.
But now I would like to turn to our final set of Grace Note speakers. Lissa Paul is a professor at Brock University in the Niagara region of Ontario, which is where she's speaking to us from now, or she's living in Toronto, and is author most recently of Eliza Fenwick, Early Modern Feminist 2019, and co-editor with Phil Nell and Nina Christensen of the new edition of Keywords for Children's Literature 2021. Lissa, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much. And I am in Toronto today. And thank you to all of you. And I'm really delighted to be here too. So, and especially since so many of the pieces you have already been under discussion are there. I was invited partly because I have this very beautiful sign numbered edition of Crow. And it has these really lovely Baskin illustrations. And it was a gift for my 21st birthday from my in-laws. I'd spotted this edition at the Harrods bookshop, probably, I'm afraid, in 1974. At the time, my husband, Jeff, and I were undergrads living in South Kensington with 5 of his engineering friends. He was a student at Imperial, and I was at Queen Mary on a junior year abroad from the University of Toronto. We are still, incidentally, very happily married. We'd eloped just a few months before. And Jeff's parents had asked him what I'd like for my birthday. And Jeff had remembered this edition of Crow that we'd seen it when we were walking through Harrods. At the time, I really didn't know how central Ted would become to my academic life. A few years later, back in Toronto, where degrees are 4 years long, and then at my master's degree viva, I was asked what I wanted to do for my PhD, and I said, without thinking, Ted Hughes. And it was only then that I started to think that I could do something on his children's books. And I didn't know at the time until Terry told me. I knew it was original, but I didn't know that it was something that nobody had really thought how to develop before. And only later did I begin to catch really glimpses of Ted's work for children in Crow. And I was delighted when Anskia later confirmed that Ted had actually started Crow as a children's story. At the beginning, I could see that Crow was like a petulant child in a trickster way in that child-adult continuum, but increasingly I've begun to think about it, that it's more of that kind of crush that we've been talking about in other contexts. I eventually learned to see the direct connections between Crow's works that he published first for children, including The Iron Man in 1968 and How the Whale Became 1963. So if I wanted to move to specifics, there is, for instance, a variant of the space bat angel dragon from Iron Man in Crow's Fall. Now in the Iron Man, the Earth is threatened by a space bat angel dragon, who's a creature who emerged from a star and then landed, and he's the size of Australia. And the Iron Man is the champion of the world who challenges him to trial by fire. The Iron Man so the Iron Man is going to challenge the space bat angel dragon. The Iron Man says he's going to sit on this bed of blazing fuel, and he then sends the space bat angel dragon on a trip to the white hot sun, where he fuses into the same blazing white as the sun itself, though eventually returns black and defeated. In Crow's Falls, Crow arrogantly challenges the sun directly. Feeling too white, he decides to attack and defeat it, but returns charred black and barely able to speak. Crow has the last lines. Up there, he managed, where white is black and black is white, I won, which of course he didn't. And then it's just hard not to think of this in the context of the American election. Besides the space bat angel dragon of Ted's children's books, in What is the Truth and How the Whale Became and all the later creation myths, there seems to be the kind of God that Ted created and he's not an all, as we've said, not an all-knowing, all-powerful biblical God. Ted's God is sort of befuddled, not sure exactly what he's doing. His creature is kind of half-baked. Now, among the How the Whale Became stories are creation myths for both the hyena and the elephant, and they're both in How the Whale Became. But in Crow's Elephant Totem, you've got a poem that begins innocently enough as a kind of fairy story. Once upon a time, God made this elephant, that it was delicate and small, it was not freakish at all, or melancholy. But then everything goes awry in this kind of cartoonish, grotesque horror show way, and the poem ends with, again, a glimpse of the space bat angel who loses his dragon capacity too. And so at the very end, in Crow's Elephant Totem song, it's the elephant who sings deep in the forest maze about a star of deathless and painless peace, but no astronomer can find where it is. And that's where I'll end and let you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lissa. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Peter Fydler. After a 30-year career in film and TV marketing, Peter retired in 2016 and, amongst other things, decided to try and engage with academic scholarship around the world of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes via all manner of fora, including Zoom. He has so far covered conference topics and article topics such as diverse as Sylvia Plath and mid-1970s criticism, Ted Hughes' influence on Nick Cave, and the artistic partnership between Baskin and Ted Hughes. And Peter is going to talk to us today about his pursuit of an uncollected Crow poem.
Okay. So my little grace note is called Crow Goes to the Movies. And my story is about the uncollected poem Crow Goes to the Movies. And it starts on page 1226 of Ted Hughes' collected poems. In the list of variant titles, I found a reference to a poem called Crow Goes to the Films, alternatively titled Crow Goes to the Movies. Ever since an eccentric teacher at school read us some extracts from Gaudete over 40 years ago, I have been obsessed by what might be termed Ted Hughes' beige period, Crow, Gaudete and cave birds. So you can imagine the thoughts of a new Crow poem was utterly all-consuming. But where was it? Why list two variant titles if there's no poem in the book? Did I have a duff copy of collected poems? Even more enticing was the prospect of it actually being some kind of corvid hoax, perhaps a nod to the trickster Crow. The next stop, of course, was Keith Sagar and Stephen Tabor's indispensable bibliography. Here there are two references to Crow Goes to the Movies, a Sotheby's auction catalogue from December the 14th, 1989, and one to some manuscripts at the University of Liverpool. I managed to track down a copy of the Sotheby's catalogue, but frustratingly, the manuscript of scribbles, probably about A3 in its original form, had been reduced down to a photograph about the size of a playing card. To be fair on Sotheby's, they had, helpfully, transcribed at least the first tantalising line of the last repetition of the draft, and I quote, "The heat's volcanic, Sahara, skullbake, black brain, tongue dust." Naturally, I googled that first phrase, "the heat's volcanic," and amazingly, even to this day, no hits. Having corresponded with Keith Sagar about an uncollected Gaudete Vacana, which starts with the line, "When the high-breasted, the halved world opens herself to you," I was very aware of the need to get every single letter exactly right. He had transcribed the poem twice, and the second version referred to a haloed world. Clearly, the difference between halved and haloed in Ted Hughes' world is enormous. So I decided to try and access the Liverpool versions and anything Emery might have. In both instances, all I got really was about 40 more pages of photocopic scribbling that didn't help with it half dozen words I just couldn't pin down in the auction catalogue. I should add that there's a certain romance about those Crow manuscripts because whilst Ted Hughes' handwriting is notoriously difficult to transcribe, with these particular examples, it is incredibly easy to see these scrawling, intertwined, scratchy ciphers as the work of a real crow. Simultaneously with this, I was working my way through the Crow manuscripts at the British Library and stumbled on a typed draft of a similar poem called Crow Goes Into Battle, which offered many clues to difficult words like jounced and cogtread. The same poem was also available to Emery with the variant titles Crow's Amulet, Corporal Crow, and my absolute favourite, Crow tells a bedtime story to his grandfather. Essentially, I think what Crow was doing in all these drafts was imagining Crow in a film like Ice Cold in Alex, Lawrence of Arabia, or Flight of the Phoenix, but despite endless attempts and redrafts, failed to really take it anywhere or come close to finishing it. For Keith Sagar and Stephen Tabor, however, it's an uncollected poem, even though it's only available in its manuscript form as a photograph in an auction catalogue. So for me, it's officially a Crow poem. Sticking to quoting extracts, I edited together various short stanzas that appear quite regularly in various drafts to create a very skeletal composite from all four sources of what is probably just the first part of a longer poem. So here goes. Crow Goes to the Movies, composite of extracts. The heat's volcanic, Sahara, skullbake, black brain, tongue dust. On the huge, slowly tilting desert, something tiny is managing to stir. It crawls like a mote in the mile-high vulture's motionless eyeball. A troop truck. It's a troop truck. The cog-tread tires explode the drifts like a tanker's staggering screws. The eyes are like leaking wounds, already red. The ears are finished like spent cartridges. The gears are in the guts, grinding on dry iron. And the heads, oh the heads, jouncing on the khaki-ragged bodies, terrible hospitals of the eyes and ears, and a few fire-shriveled snapshots. Women are over. Smiling sleep is over. Life is over, except as a puppet theatre of the voice to keep the corners of the mouth up. In the spirit of the trickster Crow, I'd like to finish by saying that everything I've just said is either 100% true or completely made up. Thank you.
Wonderful. A true Hughes obsessive. Thank you, Peter. Dangerous territory, but exhilarating too. And I'd like then finally to turn, by no means least, but most patient, to Matt Howard, who has been inspired by Ted's poetry. And you can see evidence of that on the wall behind him. Matt Howard lives in Norwich, where he works for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. His first full collection, Gall, was published by the Rialto in 2018 and was winner of the 2018 East Anglian Book Award for Poetry, shortlisted for the Seamus Heaney Centre First Collection Prize in 2019 and winning the Best First Collection in the inaugural Laurel Prize in 2020. So congratulations to Matt for that, but also just on your topic, which is being inspired by Ted Hughes. So Matt, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for having me along, Mark, and good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. As Mark said, that the picture behind me isn't there by design. It's just, it is the presiding spirit, I guess, through this weird lockdown year of every RSPB meeting I've had for the last 52 weeks. So that, whether my RSPB colleagues know that or not, who knows, but that spirit flows through all of the work that crosses this sort of outpost desk, the guerrilla structures that we're all working under now. But the short piece I'm going to read really is just about personal encounter with Hughes and what that has meant to me. So my first encounter with the work of Ted Hughes almost came during my A-levels. Unfortunately, we didn't study Hughes at all, but in whatever the standard anthology was that we were all issued with, it included just a handful of Hughes poems. Now, in there was definitely hawk roosting, there was definitely pike, and I know there was crow tyrannosaurus. So just those titles had a completely different gravitational pull and demanded that they be read. And those first two spoke to earlier childhood interests of running feral in the woods or fishing with my older brother, that by my later teens, you know, when I was sort of 17, 18, doing A-levels, that world had kind of been left behind a bit. But of course, crow tyrannosaurus was just so entirely other. But all of that meant that I had to hear more of it. And in just those three poems was the whole opening of the world of essential ideas and their expression that seemed instantly so completely alive and so completely and fully itself. I didn't then go to university, so all of my reading was self-directed. And I fell headlong into Hughes, and so too towards a deeper encounter with the natural world. I did, of course, read the up-and-coming scene and others like Larkin, etc., and liked and even loved a great deal of it. But for me, the beautiful anecdotal or the self-concerned confessional or all of the Hall of Mirrors, clever postmodern type work, I can love that, but it just doesn't ground itself enough for me. And of course, what I was getting through Hughes was the best initiation into that first concern of an interest in all the things of the world, of the more than human world. And I think through the whole of Hughes's poetics, there really does work a living range of habitats of the imagination. What I think is common among proper naturalists is that they often had somebody who introduced them to some aspect of the natural world at a young age, whether that's an uncle or a grandparent that maybe took them out birding. I didn't really have that in my family in any sort of, you know, mentor type way. So the crucial thing that brought me back to and then deeper into that concern and ultimately to my work in conservation was that encounter with Hughes's work. And so much of my endeavour at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds for the last 10 plus years has been to find ways where we can work with the culture and the arts to engage, challenge and inspire people. And quite simply, all of that flows from Hughes. And as someone who's been trying to write and have poems published for the past 14 years, if I'm honest, I'd stopped returning to Crow. I think as I knew I was building towards a first full collection, I was wary of that unique power of it. And I think I was fearing that it might overwhelm what I was trying to do. The voice is so strong. Nevertheless, about 18 months or so ago, after my book had been out just for a couple of years, I went back to it again and honestly was blown sideways afresh. As we've heard, and we've had wonderful speakers on all of this, but to condense what I think of it is so dense, yet instantly so approachable. So back in that 17, 18-year-old self, it was nevertheless still so approachable. Terribly beautiful through its super ugly language and the freedom and restless invention of its forms. I think it is a masterpiece, albeit flawed, not least because Hughes couldn't complete it. But what is clear from the publication history of those main Faber editions and all the various limited editions, and what makes it particularly fascinating for me, is that Crow kept on forcing its way with Hughes, right up to the extended recording he did for it, I think just a few years before he died, with the linked prose elements that he did for Faber and Faber in around 1995. And that's all I have to say. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Matt. That's a wonderful way to round things off. I'm so grateful to all of our speakers, to Matt for his patience, which I think really does give an extraordinary sense of the fact that Hughes's poetry can and does make things happen in a really fantastically powerful way. Just thinking of Auden, poetry makes nothing happen. This does. For life, for young lives, for conservationists too, and that's and for poets. We have of course overshot, but I would like to go back now using a chat from Michal and a question from Neil Roberts in the Q&A session to Grzegorz, if that's okay. And I will just read out Michal's observation because he reminds us that the last thing that Grzegorz was saying, and which I think it's worth coming back to, is that intergenerational trauma makes the experience of reading poetry of people like Hughes cathartic. And this is a point that puts his work in the same category as a great deal of art that deals with the horror of the human condition. And I'd just like to add to that, if that's all right, because that's a reminder of where we got to Neil's question. And I hope, Neil, you won't mind me asking it on your behalf. Grzegorz, do you see a parallel between you dealing with the trauma of the Second World War experienced by your grandfather and Hughes dealing with the trauma of World War I experienced by his father? And then finally, Jane has asked, if there's time, I'd like to hear Grzegorz tell more of his thoughts that ended when he said, think not of evil. So Grzegorz, over to you.
Think not of, yeah, the last sentence was great, because I shouldn't think a lot about, too much about evil, but yeah, so I don't want to compare myself to Ted Hughes and his experience, but I just wanted to say that you know, when your family was in concentration camps and you're dealing with trauma, and your family of your wife was hiding in the forest near Rzeszów during the Second World War because there was some allegations of Jewish roots. There are a lot of traumas, and the most weird and the most scary thing is that most of them are secret situations in Poland still. You know what I mean? That, for example, now I'm in Chapelsk near Gdańsk on the countryside, and the Red Army, who was deliberating Poland, let's say, liberating Poland, raped most of women in the north of Poland. You know what I mean? And when you ask, for example, my grandmother, she will say, no, it's not true. And if I will ask my father, he said, no, it's not true. You know, everything was cool and all right. And so I'm the first generation, I guess, which is dealing with it from the long distance. People and poetry like Ted Hughes, for me, is kind of a, it shows me how important thing is writing about nature of evil, nature of violence, because I'm reading Crow through these aspects. Also, I think that he was very inspired by Joseph Conrad, and Joseph Conrad is Joseph Korzeniowski. He was a Polish writer in same way, and also Hughes was very inspired by my Gdańsk neighbor, so Arthur Schopenhauer. In some, I remember that Hughes said that the only philosopher he read is Schopenhauer. Anyway, I think that Crow has got this kind of ability to make some catharsis situation, you know, that you're dealing with most important secret, dark aspects of human nature. And of course, you know, that there is a genetic memory, so it's proven. So we've got a lot of traumas, even if we don't think about that. And I think that this book is like a cure, really. It's not a shocking for shocking, or you know, it's not a dark spectacle. It's something really weird. I don't know what is it exactly in some way, you know. I know that Hughes was very inspired by Francis Bacon, and Francis Bacon said that artist is a kind of a sponge, and I think that Marina Warner wrote that while writing A Crow, Hughes was watching Crucifixion by Francis Bacon, right?
I was just saying that there was an exhibition of Francis Bacon at the Tate, in which his Crucifixion, in which it's after Roger van der Weyden. Roger van der Weyden is very peaceful painting compared to Bacon's, and the figures standing at the foot of the cross are these sort of screaming, almost pterodactyl-like. Actually, pterodactyl, yes, a sort of slightly bird-like primordial forms, and they're howling in anguish.
Can I ask a question about his environmentalism? And it goes back to Terry's observation, but it introduced another major Hughes critic, Lenskijai, who quoted, I think, something that Terry may have quoted in his review of The Environmental Revolution by Max Nicholson, where Hughes writes that, quote, "the story of the mind exiled from nature is the story of Western man. And Anne Skay, who can't be with us from Australia, but is clearly a leading Hughes scholar, she notes that Skijai observes Crow's Western empirical utilitarian eye, which alienates him from the inner spiritual unity of nature. And he sees Crow as chastening through ridicule Western unthinking. So Anne asks, to what extent do panelists think this is true? And do Hughes's Crow poems begin to redress this situation?
Well, I think I actually wanted to ask you, Mark, something, Mark Cocker.
Good. Go.
Because it struck me when reading Crow that actual characteristics of crows which you have shown me, of them flocking and roosting. And I remember being very struck when you said the reason they roost is they keep each other warm at night in these very cold fenland copses. And that, of course, is an environmental aspect of the birds that is missing from Hughes. Because I think this is a mystery religion of centered around a kind of trickster hero figure. And it's not really, I mean, there are environmental lessons to take from crows, which you are the greatest exponent of, which are not in Hughes's sites.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, that there are different species of corvid with different behaviors. And I think Hughes is drawing primarily upon two birds that are despised by Western thought. I mean, there's an interesting conflation in Crow of a set of mythologies from the first peoples of the Pacific Northwest, in which corvids play incredibly positive roles. And those crows, or those ravens and corvids in the Alaskan mythologies, are creators of life, are creators of humans, and are bringers of the sun and of the moon. So they play a very benign role. And I think what certainly happens in Western thought is that in our chromatic understanding of morality, black is evil, quite different from India and Hinduism, etc. And so we projected onto corvids, you know, all the evil that we've associated with nature. So I think there are two contradictory versions of crows drawing upon different source materials where nature is both seen very positively and seen very negatively. But I think it's undoubtedly the case that in the Western tradition, we feel at odds with nature. We have, as it were, always demonized the serpent and you know, made of the natural world something that we must conquer. And I think Hughes challenges that, certainly in Crow. I mean, that whole notion of nature as something inimical to us and indifferent to us and morally oblivious of human love and etc. is embedded in it. But that really hasn't really answered the question that was asked by the Australian academic, I don't think. But I don't think it just mocks Western thought, it challenges at the very core of it, is what I'd say. Yeah. That isn't strong enough. It doesn't just mock it, it challenges it. But
really radically searching, isn't it? I mean, Ted wrote that he was open for negotiation with anything that went. You know, he was not, and he talked about the poets of the immediately predecessor generation who just needed, of kind of Larkin's generation, needed not to take this on, but he could not avoid it. And I think it is that radical, deep, probing questioning in pursuit of vitality that I find so extraordinarily powerful in Crow. I'd like just to note Mick Gower's observation that in the Noel Channon film, The Artist and the Poet, Baskin acknowledges Crow as a representation of Apollo, as in the Iliad, Apollo watching the slaughter in the guise of a crow, and Hughes acknowledges the spirit of England as the bird of Bran, hence the raven still in the tower where Bran's head is rumoured to be buried. I would add to that, of course, that Hughes chose as the name for his own printing press, which he and Nick, his son, ran from Court Green, Morrigu, after the Irish death goddess, also in the form of a crow. But Hughes also didn't, he said to Sagar that, of course, he didn't want, and there was no need for his poetry to be cluttered up with this kind of museum arcana, that it ought to speak. It was all there, but it ought to speak, and it did, I think, speak on its own terms. So
yes, I mean, I just add one detail, and that is what pick up on what Matt said. It's one of the extraordinary things about Hughes' poetry, and I wasn't allowed to say where I encountered Hughes. The first poems I read were Crow, and they're actually very distinctive in his canon in some sense, because most of his nature poetry is steeped in a profound gift for looking directly at the living creature. So his poems about pike and hawk, etc., draw specifically from nature. I mean, there's no more penetrative seer of the living world in the last 50 years than Hughes. And what's ironic is that he meshes in Crow some of that directness, which is manifest in the language, but in the power of observation, which are rooted in his own seeing. And yet it's steeped in this mythology. I mean, there are so many resonances from so many different sources, both European and First Peoples of America, etc. And I think it's this which leads to its extraordinariness. You know, as Matt says, or as we've said collectively, Marina especially, it is his masterpiece, and it's a masterpiece because it summons all parts of Hughes' genius into one form. And I think that's, you know, that's something of what you said, Mark, that it's so direct and yet packed with all this mythological stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But I would just say that from my experience, and I'm a latecomer to Crow, having spent years up to my waist or chest in Hughes's rivers, but absolutely, I mean, literally, absolutely convinced by, for me, the transformative power. It has changed my life. I have woken up to nature in its minute glories entirely because of Ted's fishing diaries and the poems he drew from them. So that while he is, and absolutely, I think in Crow, mythic poet of violent nature, he is also just what you said, that very, very sharp observer of nature, and there's no one better at that. And I think that's why I'm fascinated by Barry's response to Crow's eye, you know, and the eye in Crow, you know, in the collection. Anyway, Malcolm adds, it's his capacity to re-mythologize a demythologized world, which is, I think, Hughes's greatest gift to us. That's a very wise and pithy observation, Malcolm. Thank you. And I hope Hughes has been worth returning to from the world of Coleridge. Emily Weatherby, I see, remarks that two of the panelists have made reference to Hughes and Larkin being somehow in opposition to each other, at least in regard to realism versus myth. But it seems that both have a kind of obsessive pessimism. Is there no unifying strand as well as a contrast?
Well, I suppose I shouldn't really presume, because I probably haven't read Larkin for a while. But I remember that I was, you know, personally wounded by this cynical attack on the idea of the myth kitty. And it was a kind of attack on Hughes. Yeah. But it was an attack also on a tremendous world within English language culture of actually trying to tap the sources of these ancient epic poems, ballads, myths, fairy tales. All that was being kind of rejected discursively. I mean, maybe Larkin drew on it himself within the work, but it was rejected discursively by him and his friends. What were they called? The New Moderns or something? What were they called?
I think it was the New Moderns.
Yeah, yes, the New Moderns. Somehow, and Hughes was standing for, I think, definitely re-enchanting the contemporary that he was experiencing, but through ancient, you know, antique, ancient, primordial, atavistic, deep taproots into the whole language of the British Isles. I mean, he was we had the wonderful talk about the Welsh Mabinogion. He was also Celtic, the Scottish, there was definitely the Irish Gaelic side. It was very deep in him, all the whole, I think Heaney called it Britannic, the whole Britannic legacy.
And he tells Egbert Fast that Alexander Carmichael's collection, which I'm sure you will know, Carmina Gadellana, of Scots Highland ballads and tales, is the source of most of it.
Oh, really?
Which I haven't seen anyone follow up on, but what I have read is Neil Roberts' excellent essay on Hughes and Larkin in the Ted Hughes Society Journal.
That Larkin, there is a kind of pessimism, or there's a melancholy, but actually in Hughes, although it's visceral, and the parody of him is steeped in blood, I don't think it is pessimistic. I don't find it pessimistic. I find it visceral and life-enhancing. Do you?
Well, I think there's a lot of ecstasy, isn't there? The bride and groom,
yeah,
and the love song in Crow. There's a lot of passionate ecstasy, and it is about 2 years later after Crow that he writes August,
yeah,
which is an attempt to stage a kind of mystery ritual in Persepolis, drawing on many different mythic strands, and written in a language that is the language of the body, the beyond actual lexical language of sounds. And in fact, it's apparently quite like ancient Greek, but nevertheless, it was an attempt to bypass the intellect. He was so worried about the intellect closing down our passionate energies.
I agree. In my opinion, it's kind of a vital pessimism. It's something more than pessimism. It's not just pessimistic, and I think that this vitality makes it so extraordinary, and it's like a bomb, because it's not just a pessimistic message to the humanity or to himself, but it's a mix of 10 different things, and it's all vital and full of ecstasy, and in same way it is pessimistic in the way of a core. You know what I mean? There is no heaven. Let's say
it's dark.
It's not.
It's dark, but I wouldn't say it was pessimistic.
It's dark. All right. Dark is a good description. Yeah, I agree.
And I would just say that in Jack and Moira Sweeney's papers in UCD, and Jack Sweeney was the guy who introduced Ted to Barry Cook, and Barry always talked about his paintings being about actual vitality. They believed, both of them, very passionately in the realities of life and death, but seizing that vitality in an extraordinary sensual way. Barry probably even more so than Ted. But Ted sent Jack Sweeney a copy of Crow and said, here is Crow, most of it. Everybody says it's negative, but the whole point is it's positive, rightly read. I think it's been an extraordinarily rich and exchange of views over the last couple of hours, and I'm so grateful, first to our participants for dialing in around the world and staying with us in such extraordinary numbers for 2 hours. 110 means that we have not tried hard enough. But also, of course, to our very distinguished panelists, all 10 of my co-speakers, but particularly Marina, Mark, Alice, and Grzegorz. But what I would like to close with is the final lines of Ted's recording of a poem given to Crow by an Eskimo, or a spirit of an Eskimo. And I think it speaks, and there is a letter somewhere that Barry writes to Seamus Heaney celebrating this poem about water as the sign of a turning point in their friend. And I think it is also a beautiful place to end in terms of the elemental purity of the challenge of Crow. So I think we ought to give Ted the last word, but thank you all very much indeed for coming, and here it is.
It went to the womb, it met maggot and rottenness. It came weeping back, it wanted to die. It went to time, it went through the stone door. It came weeping back. It went searching through all space for nothingness. It came weeping back. It wanted to die. Till it had no weeping left. It lay at the bottom of all things, utterly worn out, utterly clear.